Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the formal criminal justice system. So there are two lectures for this week. The one that you're watching right now is focused on the steps in the formal criminal justice process. The next lecture, you're going to learn about what's known as the criminal justice funnel and the factors that cause this funneling or winnowing effect. As you know from reading in your textbook, that most offenders do not work their way through all of the steps in the so-called formal criminal justice system. Instead, that they may enter at the top of or at the beginning of the criminal justice system, but then for whatever reason and reasons we're going to be learning about, they don't make it all the way through to the end of the system. And so that's what this week is dedicated to, looking at both the formal and the so-called informal criminal justice process. So, what is the criminal justice system? Well, when we talk about the criminal justice system, or the CGS, as it's often going to be referred throughout the course of the semester, we're really talking about two elements or two aspects of the criminal justice system. One aspect that we're referencing is what's known as the stages of the criminal justice system. In other words, the distinct steps through which an offender has the possibility of passing through. And so, this lecture really focuses a lot on those steps and the stages. So we have stages and steps within the stages. And so when we talk about the criminal justice system, we're talking about those stages: the police procedure stage, the trial stage, the prosecutorial stage, etc. And within each of those stages are specific steps. We're going to be focusing on that in this lecture. That the criminal justice system is more than just the stages through, that an offender may pass through, but it also includes the agencies that are charged with enforcing the laws at each of these stages. Okay. And so that, when it comes to the police procedures, that's a stage within the criminal justice system, but it's law enforcement that's responsible for enforcing or implementing the specific steps within the police procedure stage. And so for law enforcement, that would include like the Milwaukee Police Department or the Waukesha Police Department, right? And so, they're the ones who are going to be making initial contact with people. They're the ones that are potentially going to be arresting an individual. But there are federal agencies as well, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. And so agencies are in charge of enforcing the laws within those different stages in the criminal justice system. The prosecutor, or the office of the prosecutor, that the prosecutor is basically the top law enforcement agent within a jurisdiction. And so we have prosecutors at the county level, we have prosecutors at the state level, and we have federal prosecutors as well. And so when it comes to the prosecutorial stage, it's really the office of the prosecutor or that agency that's responsible for it. Okay. And then obviously the court and the correctional system, okay? All of these are agencies that you're going to be learning about, and these are the agencies that are responsible for implementing those different steps within the stages of the criminal justice system. Now, as I already stated, this lecture is focusing on the formal criminal justice process. It focuses on the process that takes an offender through a series of decision points within the criminal justice system. And so as you'll be reading and as we're going to be learning this lecture, that there are key decisions that are made at each point in the process, right? The decision to have initial contact, the decision to investigate somebody, the decision to arrest somebody, the prosecutor decision to charge somebody, the decision to actually try somebody, and the decision points kind of go on. And so a lot of times when we think about the criminal justice process, we sort of think about it as an assembly line, right? Like an assembly line in a factory, it's like the first worker, if you're building a car, will put in, rivets, and the next one will put on doors, and the next one will put on windows, right? The next one will put the engine in. That's a really bad example of an assembly line. But it's sort of like one step, one step, one step, all the way down the line until it's completed. And so, when we learn about sort of the process, the formal process, we think about it as an assembly line. But as we're going to be learning and exploring in the next lecture, lecture number 2, very few people are processed through all of the steps, okay? And that's what's known as the criminal justice funnel, okay? We'll be talking about that in lecture 2. A funnel, as you know, like if you're trying to get like liquid into a bottle that has a really narrow opening, a funnel, it starts off really big at the top and you pour the water in there, and then it gets narrow and narrow and narrow until it goes into the very narrow neck of the bottle. And that's basically, when we look at going through the steps in the criminal justice process, it really is much more of a funnel. For example, a lot of crimes are committed in the United States, but half of them are never reported to the cops. Even for the crimes that are reported to the police, 20% of them are cleared, where we actually find the offender and arrest an offender, a person, for committing that crime. Okay. The vast majority of people, they might be charged, but they never actually go to trial. They plead out. Okay. And so, that we really sort of see that there is this funneling effect. So while we're learning the assembly line, you should keep in mind that many do not make it through all of the steps. So we're going to be talking about, whether the positive and negative aspects of the funneling effect. There are distinct reasons why that offenders don't go through, or potential offenders don't go through the steps, okay? And 2 of the main reasons are the courtroom work group and the criminal justice wedding cake, okay? And so we'll go into more details in the next lecture, but, there are, with the courtroom work group, there's a group of people, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the judge, and others who work together and have shared values. And one of the main values is get the offender through the system as quickly as possible. And so that contributes to that funneling, that winnowing effect. And we're also going to see the wedding cake, how that also contributes to it, okay? But first, we're going to learn about the steps, because it's important to know what those steps are, because some offenders do go through all of the steps. So let's get started. So when I teach about the formal criminal justice system, I like to teach it through the lens of this excellent series from several years back that was on HBO, and it's called The Night Of. And the reason that it is called The Night Of is because this is a series. It's a limited series, right? So it's like 8 episodes, and it's a complete story. It's not like a serial where you have season after season. But it's called The Night Of because it basically starts with the night of a potential murder, and it follows the accused through the formal steps of the criminal justice process. It is a great limited series, and it's also been heralded by people who work within the criminal justice system as actually being a fairly accurate portrayal of the criminal justice process. So I'm going to use this example of this TV series to help bring to light the steps within the stages of the criminal justice process. But to do that, let me tell you a little bit about the series itself. And if you're anything like me, I love watching TVs and movies. And now that there's a writer's strike and an actor's strike, I'm having to dig deep into the archives to find new things to watch. So if you haven't seen this series, check it out because it's really good. Now, what this series is about is it's about a young man here, and I'll circle him. And the name of his character is Nazir Khan. And he may look familiar to you. Nazir Khan is played by Riz Ahmed. Riz Ahmed is a British actor and a British rapper. He's been in a lot of different television shows, but he's also been in a really cool movie called The Sound of Metal. It's about a person who plays in a heavy metal band and begins to lose his hearing. But in The Night Of, he plays Nazir Khan. And Nazir Khan is a Pakistani American. He was born in the United States, but he comes from immigrant family from Pakistan. And he leads a really sheltered life. He lives in Queens, which is one of the boroughs in New York City. He leads a very sheltered life. He doesn't have a lot of opportunities, always studying, not having a lot of opportunity to have fun. So one night his best friend invites him to this cool party that's going to be in New York City. And Nazir Khan is really excited about it because he's like, dude, I never get to do fun things. So we're finally going to go out in the town, go into the city, into actual Manhattan, and, have some fun. Well, his friend backs out on him and says, I can't do it. And Nazir Khan is really disappointed. And so Nazir Khan's going to go anyways. And so he steals his dad's taxi. His dad is a taxi driver. And he steals it. He takes it without his permission. And he's going to drive himself into into Manhattan to go to this party. Now, Nazir Khan does not know Manhattan very well. He pretty much gets lost. And he's driving around this cab, and people keep hailing at him because they think that it's an actual cab and they're looking for a ride. But he's not picking anybody up, except when he comes across this young woman here, and her name is Andrea Cornish. Okay, she comes up to his taxi cab. Nazir Khan thinks she is beautiful. He's in the city to have fun, and so he picks her up. And he says, where do you want to go? And she takes one look at Nazir Khan and she's like, hey, you want to go back to my apartment? And he's like, giddy up. Let's go do that. So, he's kind of looking just to have some fun, but it kind of gets a little deep for him in terms of the kinds of fun. They go back to her apartment. They start doing shots of tequila. They start doing drugs. They start playing this weird game with a knife where they're trying to go between their fingers and not actually stab themselves, but they actually somebody does actually, their hand does actually get accidentally stabbed. And then they have sex. So they go up into her bedroom and they have sex. In the morning, Nazir wakes up and he's passed out. And he finds himself in the kitchen. And he's like, whoa, I did way too many drugs. I drank too much alcohol. And it's really early in the morning. He's like, I've got to get out of here. And so he goes up to say goodbye to Andrea. And he goes up, the lights are off. He turns on the lights and she's stabbed to death. That her whole body is riddled with stabs. He freaks out. He doesn't remember anything of that nature taking place. He runs out of the apartment. He realizes that he left his jacket in the apartment. He goes back to the apartment. The door's locked. He breaks the front door, the glass, in order to get in to get his jacket because the jacket has the keys for his dad's cab. And then he basically, flees the apartment. And so that's how it starts. It starts with this murder. And then we'll talk about in a little bit, he gets arrested and he gets a private attorney whose name is John Stone, who is played by the great John Turturro from such movies as Do the Right Thing and Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? So he is going to be his defense attorney. And then you have here, this is Helen Weiss. She is the Manhattan prosecutor, the New York City prosecutor, who is prosecuting the case against Nazir Khan. And then this is the hard-boiled detective box, the homicide detective, who does everything in his power to basically get Nazir Khan to confess to the crime. And so, the story is about what happens. Is he guilty? Does he go to trial? What happens at trial, etc. I won't do any spoils, but it's a great show. It's not just good, but it, as we're going to see, it does a really good job of illustrating the steps within the criminal justice process. All right, so before we apply and, use the night of as examples to bring to life these different the stages in the criminal justice process, let's just list what the stages are, okay? So there are 4 stages in the criminal justice process, and each of the stages has a number of steps associated with them. And so in stage 1 is the police procedures. It is the stage that deals primarily with law enforcement. Stage 2 is what's known as the prosecutorial stage, and that is the stage that deals with the decision that the prosecutor is going to make to charge somebody with a crime. And if they do charge somebody with a crime, basically the steps to prepare for trial. Stage 3 is the trial stage. That's the activities that take place in a courtroom during a trial. And so the trial stage is if somebody exercises their Sixth Amendment right to a trial. And then stage 4 is the correctional procedures, okay? And that's where whether you are tried and found guilty and sentenced, or whether you plead out and are found guilty, or you plead guilty and get sentenced. Obviously, the correctional procedures are where you are either under probation or in secure confinement in a prison or a jail. Now, there are many steps within these, and we're going to look at those each individually, but I just want to let you know that there is an extra credit quiz this week where you will be challenged to put the steps and the stages of the criminal justice process in the correct order, and depending on how well you do, you can earn different amounts of extra credit. We'll talk more about that quiz at the end of this lecture. Okay, so the first stage is the police procedures stage. And, police are oftentimes referred to as the gatekeepers of the formal criminal justice process. Basically they're the gatekeepers because they make the decision, police make the decision about whether or not they're going to actually have initial contact with somebody who they suspect of engaging in some sort of criminal activity. So if they decide not to have an initial contact, or they have an initial contact, but they just think, oh, there's no reason to arrest this individual. They're a gatekeeper. The police get to decide who goes on, through the stages and who doesn't. And, that as we're going to be learning later in the semester, when we talk about police and police discretion, we give police a lot of discretion to decide whether or not to bring somebody into the criminal justice process. They use their professional judgment. They use their discretion to decide whether it's worth bringing them in. And sometimes that discretion is good, right? Because you want police, if somebody calls the cops and says, hey, I'm hearing some really weird noises out in front of my house. Can you come and check it out? And the police come and they check it out and they're like, well, yeah, there's some weird noises because for whatever reason, somebody's mowing their lawn at, 2 a.m. and somebody's screaming at them to shut off the alarm. It's not a fight, right? But they're coming and they're just like checking it out and they're like, hey, we don't need to really go forth from there. And so it's good, that police are allowed to use their discretion. It can also be really bad too, particularly if they use their discretion in a way that is biased or subjective, that they bring some people into the process and others don't, not based on the probable cause of the crime that they've committed, but based on other factors like race or class or gender. And so we'll be learning more about the police discretion as we move forward. So there are several steps within the police procedure stage. Number 1 is initial contact. Number 2 is investigation. Number 3 is arrest. And number 4 is being taken into custody. Okay. And so let's talk about each of these separately. And so the initial contact, like it says, that's the step where law enforcement make initial contact with an individual. They can make that initial contact from observation. So, I live in River West and we have bicycle cops and, as they're driving through the neighborhood, they might just come across somebody. They might observe something and they might go and make that initial contact to check out what's going on. But you could also be contacted by a victim. An informant could contact the police, or you could have an informant and says, hey, this is a criminal activity that I'm observing. Somebody could come to the police office and make a confession. There's lots of different ways where that initial contact takes place. In the night of, the way the initial contact takes place is that after Nazir Khan breaks back into the apartment to get his coat and the keys so he can drive away in his dad's taxi cab, he gets pulled over by the cops. He makes a turn without using his turn signal, and he gets pulled over. And the police officers say, roll down your window. And he does. And the whole car just reeks of tequila and alcohol. And so they make that initial contact. And the next thing that they do is they engage in the initial contact is pulling Nazir over for not using their turn signal. The next step is an investigation of that incident. Okay. Now, an investigation can take a few minutes. It can take months, right? I mean, we've been seeing at the federal level with the investigation of individuals who engaged in the January 6th insurrection, the investigation of Hunter Biden, the investigation of the former President Trump. I mean, those investigations, have gone on, for many months, if not years, right? And so investigations by law enforcement can go on for quite some time. In the case of Nazir Khan, the investigation was pretty darn quick. They gave him a breathalyzer. He didn't pass the breathalyzer. He was drunk. And then, basically they had to make a decision about what to do next. And that brings us to the next step, which is arrest. Now, in most circumstances, Nazir Khan would have been arrested. He blew above the level. He was clearly engaging in a DUI, and most times he would get arrested and brought into custody and potentially charged. But in this case, that as they were investigating the pulling over of Nazir Khan, the law enforcement got a call saying that there was a report of a murder. And of course, that murder is Andrei Kornich. And so suddenly they're like, whoa, like we need to go be on the spot because a really serious crime just took place. So they didn't really know what to do with Nazir Khan. They didn't really arrest him, but they put him in the back of their squad car, kind of trying to figure out what they were going to do with him. And so in this case, it's, that something else took priority. But, usually if an investigation has probable cause that a crime has taken place, somebody will be arrested. But just because you're arrested doesn't mean you're actually going to be put into custody. The arrest is where you have probable cause that a crime has been committed, and then your liberty is taken away. But the custody is where you're actually turned over to the police station. You're turned over, you're fingerprinted, you're frisked, etc. So you're basically taken. You become within the custody of the police, of law enforcement. Okay, and he is ultimately taken into custody, but not within this first. It takes place a lot later after they get him. They're going to let him go, actually, and then they're like, "Hey, before we let you go, we're going to frisk you real quick." And they frisk him, and they find a knife on him. Okay, but that kind of brings to life those different steps. So stage 2 is the prosecutorial stage, okay? And in the prosecutorial stage, the main player is the prosecutor, okay? So I did say that the prosecutor is like the top law enforcement official within a county or within a state or a federal jurisdiction. But the prosecutor is a law enforcement because they are enforcing the law. But prosecutors are lawyers, right? They charge people with crimes, and then they basically go to trial to prove the guilt beyond a reasonable doubt of the individual who's charged with the crime. And so there are different steps within the prosecutorial stage, and let me put these up here. And then we'll walk through each of these separately, and then we'll talk about how it kind of plays out in the night of, although we have a lot of contemporary issues of this as well. So the first thing that a prosecutor decides is whether or not they're going to charge this individual with a crime. Okay. And just because you have been arrested and taken into custody, that doesn't mean you're going to be charged with a crime. That sometimes prosecutors exercise what's known as nolli prosequi. And what that basically means is that they're deciding not to pursue this case. And a prosecutor will do that because they just don't think there's enough evidence that if it goes to trial that they'll be able to get a conviction, right? You can't charge somebody on a hunch that they did something. You have to be very certain that you're going to be able to make your case in a court of law. And so sometimes prosecutors, and again, that's step funneling. You step out because the prosecutor decides they're not going to pursue charges. Now, there is a check on the power of the prosecutor, and we've heard a lot about these recently because of, in particular, the the charges that former President Trump is getting. That we know that the prosecutor themselves are not the ones who charge somebody, but they get advice from either the grand jurors. Okay, we'll learn more about the grand jury in the preliminary hearing later in the semester. But a grand jury is it's a big jury. That's why it's called grand, and there's like 20 people on it. And they basically hear the evidence that the prosecutor presents to them, and then they decide whether or not a person should be charged, whether they should be indicted for a crime. It's pretty easy to get an indictment as a prosecutor, but you don't always get an indictment. A preliminary hearing is another check on the charging power of the prosecutor. A preliminary hearing takes place in the courtroom between a judge and the defense attorney and the prosecutor. Okay. And so the second step is, in deciding whether to charge, there's a check on the power of the prosecutor's charging authority. And that comes through either the grand jury or the preliminary hearing. The arraignment, and we've had a lot of arraignments on TV recently. 19 people were arraigned through the Georgia case about the electoral fraud. Arraignment is where you basically come to the courthouse and you are brought into custody and you are fingerprinted. You get a mugshot. You're booked. And then you appear before a judge, and then you say whether or not you are going to plead guilty or not guilty. Okay, and most people at their arraignment will often plead not guilty, and then decide whether they're going to plead guilty later. At that point, they'll decide whether or not there's going to be bail set. That sometimes you just let go on your own recognizance and you don't have to pay bail. Sometimes bail is set. In the most recent Georgia incident with the arraignment, bail was set quite significantly for the 19 defendants, some over $100,000. If you can make bail, then you make bail. You get to go home. If you can't make bail, then you're kept in detention. And that while all but one, although I think one finally in Georgia did, make the bail, as you're going to learn in this class, the vast majority of people having a bail set, it becomes very difficult for them, and they basically sit in the jail system waiting for trial. And then the last step in the prosecutorial stage is the plea bargaining. Basically, the negotiations between the prosecutor and the defense attorney about whether or not the client will plead guilty. Hunter Biden's a really good example of that, right? Recently, Hunter Biden, he was charged with tax fraud and some gun charges, and they had a plea agreement saying that he was going to plead guilty to these things and that he was going to have a pretrial diversion to prevent any having to go to prison. And the plea bargain fell apart, and now basically he's going to get charged, and they're going to bring him potentially to trial. And so all of those are the steps in there. In the night of, it's great. Helen Weiss is this hard-boiled prosecutor. She gets a lot of pressure from her boss, the DA, the district attorney of Manhattan, to basically say, I want you to charge this person, but charge in a way that gets it through the system pretty quick. And then they actually do agree at a plea bargain where Nazir Khan says he'll plead guilty to serving only 10 years in prison, which is really a great deal for because rather than a homicide, it was manslaughter. But then when he actually goes for the plea bargain, something happens, and the plea bargain is taken off the table, sort of similar to what happened with Hunter Biden. And so if you watch that, you'll sort of see that play itself out in action. Okay, so the next stage is what's known as the trial stage, okay? It's stage 3 in the criminal justice process. And let me just go ahead and put all the steps up here, and then we'll go through them each individually. Now, as you'll learn in your textbook, the vast majority of cases do not go to trial, okay? About 10% of cases actually end up in a trial. Most people engage in a plea bargain because oftentimes when you get to that point of being charged, that the writing is on the wall that you're likely to be convicted, and people want to plead down to a lesser sentence in hopes of getting or to a lesser charge in hopes of getting a lesser sentence. However, as we know, because we have court TV, people go to trial and they don't plead out. And so the first step is the trial itself. that you can have a trial before a judge or a jury, but you have the right to a jury trial, but you can waive that and have your trial decided by a single judge. The next step is sentencing. So if the trial, if you're found not guilty, it stops there, right? If you're acquitted of the crime, then you don't go on to step 2 in the trial stage, okay? But if you are found guilty, the next step is sentencing, and there's a broad range of things that can happen to you in the United States. You can be sentenced to probation, you can get a fine, you can be sentenced all the way to the death penalty, okay? And so we'll be learning about sentencing this semester. Also within the trial stage is the appeal. Everybody gets a right to one appeal. And so if you are found guilty, then you have the right to appeal that decision. And so it takes place after the conviction. The prosecutor, the state, cannot appeal a finding of not guilty, okay, because that gives way too much power to the state. If the state could just, appeal, they would just find, a judge that said, oh yeah, let's retry this. So if you're acquitted, that's it. The state doesn't get a chance to appeal. And that in an appeal, you're sort of looking for, hey, were the individual's rights violated during the trial? Was there a lack of fairness? Was there incompetence in terms of the defense, etc.? Okay, and so we'll learn more about that. But trial, sentencing, appeal. In this, with the night of. John Turturro, he just plays a great defense attorney. He's smart, but he's really nervous. And, the trial is very interesting. I'll just leave it at that. And here he is holding up a knife in the bloody lamp. And he has quite an argument to make, given sort of the evidence that surrounded Andre Cornish's death. And then the last stage is stage 4, the correctional procedures. And one of the reasons I suggest you watch The Night Of is because of the just wonderful performance by Michael Kenneth Williams, who just died within the last several years of a drug overdose. But he's an excellent actor. If you ever watched The Wire, he played Omar on The Wire, one of the most iconic characters within a television series. If you haven't watched The Wire, watch The Wire too. But in this, he plays this an individual called Freddie Knight, and who is he's a convicted felon involved in some really brutal acts, but he's actually in the jail. This takes place in Rikers Island. Nasir Khan, they do not set bail for him because of the severity of the crime. And so he has to wait out in Rikers Island, which, as you probably know, is one of the worst jails in the United States and very dangerous. And, when he first gets there, it looks like his life's on the line, that he's not going to make it through staying at Rikers. But he aligns himself with the gang associated with Freddie Knight to get protection. What's really interesting about this show is to look at this mild-mannered, bookworm who then gets involved, is accused of this crime. And as you can see, he shaves his head, gets aligned with a gang, bringing drugs into Rikers Island, and he totally transforms as an individual. Even though he hasn't even been convicted, just his experience at Rikers Island transforms him in a very negative way. And so it brings to life, sort of the costs associated, but also just the realities of the correctional stage. And so there are 3 steps in this stage. The correctional treatment. And so the correctional treatment is any sentence that you get not any sentence that you get, but any sentence that brings into the picture the correctional agency. And so if you get probation, you have a probation officer that secure confinement, if either in a jail if it's less than a year sentence, or in a state penitentiary or federal penitentiary for a longer period of time. And so the first step is that treatment. Then you are released, and you're oftentimes released with, certain sort of provisions of checking in with a parole officer, meeting certain guidelines. And then also the treatment and care that ideally post-offenders get after they are released. They may be asked to spend time in the community, to bridge a community correction center to sort of bridge them into, make their reentry process more easy. But those are the steps within that stage. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of the 4 stages and the steps within the stages. Obviously, I'm relying on you to read your textbook to get a lot more detail about each of those steps, okay? But you do have this extra credit opportunity this week to earn some points. And so it gives you an opportunity to test yourself on the steps of that are in the criminal justice process. It's a drag and drop quiz, and so it like has the stages and then it has the steps, and then you drag it until it's in the right order. You can take the test as many times as you want. You get unlimited tests. Try to do it without your notes or textbook. Sure, you could cheat, but why bother, right? And actually, to do it really quickly and win extra points, you really need to know the steps, okay? And it does, referring to your notes is going to make it more difficult. So don't use your notes or textbooks. Just try to really learn it before you take the quiz. And anybody who gets the steps in the right order, no matter how many attempts it takes, y'all get 5 extra credit points, okay? But for the first 5 students that do it in the least amount of time, in other words, the quickest, they'll get an additional, at least an additional 5 extra credit points, okay? It's a lot of fun, and it's a good way to test your knowledge. And so, hey, thanks for listening to the lecture, and I appreciate your time and attention, and I will talk to you again soon.